Thank you everyone for virtually attending tonight. I'm Gracie here representing print. And I just have a few little housekeeping details to get us started while everyone kind of files in. If you have any questions during the conversation, please feel free to enter them in the chat box, which is on the bottom right of your screen, or in the question and answer function, which is on the bottom bar of your screen. If you'd like a signed copy of tonight's book, I'll include the link to the print page in the chat and you can click on through. We have plenty in stock, so get them while they're there. And now for tonight's speakers. Dr. Radis was drawn to a career in medicine after meeting an osteopathic family practice bush pilot in Baja, Mexico. Following an internal medicine residency, the young doctor moved his family to Peaks Island off the coast of Maine and traveled by boat to the 4 year-round islands in Casco Bay, logging more than 100 house calls each year. In recognition of his commitment to public health, Dr. Radis has been named both the Louis Hanson Maine Physician of the Year and Teacher of the Year at the University of New England College of Osteopathic Medicine, a rare achievement. Brian Kevin is a magazine writer based in Maine and the editor-in-chief of Downey's Magazine. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Outside, Audubon, Sierra, Men's Journal, Travel and Leisure, Mother Jones, High Country News, and other publications. His essays have also been featured in Best American Sports Writing, Best American Food Writing, and Best American Essays. He's the author of The Footloose American, following the Hunter S. Thompson Trail across South America, which won the Maine Literary Award for Nonfiction. So please join me in virtually welcoming Chuck and Brian.
Hello.
Hello, here we are. It's good to see you.
Great to see you. I wanted to have a couple of thank yous. Just
yeah, you mentioned that. You should. That's great.
To thank you, Brian. For helping with this and being the moderator, and also in this month's issue of Downey's Magazine, you were nice enough to include an excerpt from the first chapter, and that was an unexpected pleasure. Thank you. And thanks to Gracie Dici of Print Bookstore and all independent bookstores wherever you are. I think they're not only surviving among the big box stores, but they're thriving in many areas. And I wish the best to Print, because they're a real landmark in the Portland area. Lastly, I did want to just mention an early reader, Betsy Gaddis, who wrote comments on my 21 years ago, my 2000 manuscript. Betsy was a long-term copy editor at the Portland Press Herald. And it just tragically, and my wife and I are still just wrapping our heads around it. She and her husband passed away about a month ago in a traffic accident, and we are just our hearts go out to her family, and Betsy, I think, would have been smiling right now to be on right now to enjoy this, and so she was a great friend. So.
Yeah, it's, we live in a small state, and it's always something how many lives a person can touch, and I think that's a pretty terrific tribute. And I want to thank you for inviting me to do this, and honestly, we owe you the thanks for allowing us to excerpt Go by Boat, which we're here to talk about in the magazine this month. The many people who are joining us tonight. This is great to see. They don't know that you and I had an opportunity to have a conversation, what was maybe a month and a half ago now, in preparation for the excerpt. And so it was really terrific for me to get to hear a little bit about your background and how the book came together. And I'm excited to let people in on some of those details and explore some of the topics that we had a chance to talk about then. Probably a good place to start, though. I wonder if you might just give us a little bit of backstory as to the circumstances of the book and how they came about. I'm sure that this could probably be, your next book if you really wanted to. But if you were on peaks practicing general medicine from 85 to 91, that's the period the book covers. Is that right?
Right,
Do you
right.
want to tell us a little bit about just the program that brought you there and the circumstances that brought you to the island in 85?
Sure, sure. So I went through medical school and on a National Health Service Corps scholarship. And it's kind of like being in the military in that you owed a year of service for every year that they paid tuition. And they allow you then to do your residency before, you know, there are places around the country where National Health Service Corps public health doctors are placed. In the years leading up to my commitment to payback, the budget was really slashed. This is going all the way back to the Reagan years. Oh my goodness. And Reagan slashed the budget. And so they created what was called private practice option, and that you could create your own area that wasn't part of a pre-established federal clinic. And that would have to fulfill criteria. You know, it would have to be a place that had very little in the way of physician coverage. There were income levels, and for many of the people here from the greater Portland area who now know about Peaks Island, back in the mid 80s, Peaks Island was one of the poorest neighborhoods in Portland. And in fact, all of the Casco Bay Islands had a lot of poverty. And so working with those islands over about a year and a half while I was in my residency, they were able to get the paperwork in, and working with state and federal officials, they were able to be qualified for me to come out. And I ended up moving out to Peaks Island. And from there, then operated a private practice on Peaks Island, ran the health center 2 or 3 days a week, ran a clinic on Chebeague Island a couple days, mornings a week, and then did house calls on Long and Cliff. But it was quite a process trying to fit that in as I was finishing up my residency. And I, you know, ultimately I couldn't have been happier to have worked that I actually could be stationed right in the shadow of Portland.
And so were you stationed in the shadow of Portland because you went to that program and said Peaks Island and the islands of Casco Bay, that's where I would like to spend this time, or were you steered to it?
Oh, you know, in the little community hospital I was doing my residency, we would have Peaks Islanders and occasionally Long and Cliff Islanders come in, and they typically, because they had very little in the way of healthcare, they would come in at death's door often. You know, if they were diabetics, they'd had diabetes for 5 years and didn't know it, or they had a pneumonia that they just had to be evacuated off the island. So they would come into our little community hospital. They would often be in the intensive care unit, but they were very, very resilient. They like just pulled back, you know, little old ladies in their 80s, you know, in 3 or 4 days were, you know, like raring to go. And so I really admired a lot of the people I came in contact with at my little hospital the first couple of years. And I knew through another physician who was going out just a morning or two a week to Peaks, you know, I knew something about the clinic out here, and it was really something that I was prepared with a lot of work for it not to work out, you know, and to be placed somewhere. But, you know, I had the time to work with the different islands.
I want to ask, I hope this isn't too boring of a question, because to me it's fascinating. And if people in the comments think this is a ridiculous thing to ask, you can scold me. But something that struck me reading the book, and that echoes in my head again as Grace reads your introduction, the idea of doing 100 house calls a year. Do I have that right? 100 house calls a year to these 4 year-round island communities. And honestly, growing up, I'm 40, you know, and in the turn of the 21st century medicine, I have maybe seen the same doctor twice in a row, like all of 3 times in my life. If I want an appointment to see my primary care physician, that takes 2 months. The notion of receiving a house call is as foreign and anachronistic to me as if you told me you were putting leeches on people, or I don't understand the basic mechanics of how it works. And I would love to. When a house call was requested, what did that process look like? How much did you know before you had to pack this tiny bag, before you had to pack this tackle box? How much did you know about what you were going to find when you got there? To what extent were they all sort of dire emergencies versus more work a day, situations? And then sort of what happened to whatever you were supposed to be doing at the clinic when you were suddenly hopping on a boat to go see someone on an island that couldn't get to you?
So very few of the house calls were true emergencies. Those we on Peaks and on Shabig, there were police services in which they were also trained as EMTs. We're really fortunate. And so I was a little out of the loop most of the time with the true emergencies. But for instance, on Peaks, it became really clear in the first few months that because the nurse who was working with me, she knew the island backwards and forward, and she knew who the homebound people were. And so occasionally one of these homebound folks would be able to drag themselves into the office. But homebound here often meant something a little different than homebound in town. There would be people who you just couldn't imagine how they hang on at home, living alone sometimes with all of the problems they had, and hadn't left the house, some of them in a long, long time. And so they would become my house call rounds. So I had regular on Peaks Island, I had maybe 8 or 10 people who I would see regularly. And I might make 2 or 3 of those in a late afternoon, early evening, regularly, say every 6 weeks or every 2 months. On the other islands, like Shabig, because there was a clinic, same situation. There were people who were chronically ill, and between Peaks and Shabig, that made up about 85% of the total population of the islands, the 2 islands that had clinics. Where it got very uncertain and sometimes more than I bargained for would be house calls on Long Island or Cliff Island, because there was no clinic, there was really no other staff person who would go with me. And often I would just try to feel them out over the phone about whether it was something that I could potentially help out with if I made a house call out there, or whether I would really try to insist that they have to be taken off the island in the fireboat. The fireboat was our rescue boat.
And the opening chapter, and I think the reason that it appealed to us as an excerpt is just because it is, like so much of the book, it's just a kind of a ripping good yarn, sort of, tells, it recounts one of the instances where I suppose you were thinking on your feet. I don't know how common it was when someone had to be evacuated or brought to the fireboat on a rocking chair over what sounds like a fairly sort of rutted path. How often did you find yourselves in circumstances like that were a little bit swashbuckling?
2 or 3 times a year, maybe.
Okay.
Those real, more often the challenge in house calls were in people who were sick and didn't want to leave their particular island to get hospitalized.
Yeah.
And so I would be negotiating with them over the phone about, well, no, we need to do this. And they would say no. And I would say, well, I would end up going out sometimes knowing that the best thing for them to be would be hospitalized.
Sure.
And ultimately sometimes convincing them, but other times, I was placed in the position of treating someone who just said, do what you can. And, this was a little bit having to do with the island mores, just the way people were, their expectations. Some of the people were not, they were not interested in see a specialist in town. Some of them wanted to be treated no matter what they had by a primary care person, which in my training wasn't the way it worked. You know, you as a general internist, you know, you were trained to recognize your limits, and a person who needed cardiology consult was very easy to get. So a lot of my house calls were, not a lot of the house calls, but there were a percentage of the house calls in which I was negotiating, trying to do the right thing for the person. And ultimately, if they didn't agree that day to do what I felt was the right thing, you know, we would be back talking with them the next day, particularly if they weren't doing well.
The book, for anybody who hasn't read it yet, and I get the impression from in the chat that plenty of folks have, but you know, recounts the story of this period in your life. Yeah, in one part, sort of telling these ripping good yarns of you know, the more harrowing exploits that happened along the way. In one part, you know, it deals quite a bit with delving into the characters that surrounded you, and I'm very curious to talk about how you thought about who became a character in the book and who didn't. But it is very much the story of this constant work of diplomacy, it seems like, and forging the relationships that allow you to practice medicine well, and then also just to be a good neighbor and a good person. And it's interesting to me how much you are able to revisit in the book these push and pull conversations with trying to sort of bargain almost with people to allow you to help them look out for their best interest. In the promotional sort of blurb for the book, you know, it mentions, I don't see if I have it written down, but I'll paraphrase it, that, you know, you arrived on the island, you know, sort of out of step with the mores, to use the word you just used that defined Peaks Island. You know, concisely, what were those? What set Peaks Island apart in 1985 from the mainland? And then maybe we can talk a little bit about how that's changed in the time since.
Well, a couple things really surprised me about all the islands, and that, you know, even as I was trying to coordinate their application, I would have thought that they were very similar. And Peaks Island being closest to Portland and having, you know, at one time had an amusement park out here in the 20s and a lot of grand hotels, and then gone way down in the Depression. Peaks has always been a little different. You know, we despite it being a poor island, there were a lot of people who commuted to Portland, but even on Peaks, they didn't often have great things to say about Long Island or Cliff Island. Shabig was far enough away that, you know, it wasn't in the sphere here, but certainly when I visited other islands, Peaks was viewed very negatively, and often, you know, in terms of intelligence and the fishermen, and there had been some quarrels between some of the islands. I just wasn't prepared, and sometimes got in trouble with talking about one island when I was on another island. The depth of resentment or tension,
Yeah,
that was present between the islands. Now, that wasn't never, like everything, it's not 100% thing, because certainly there were people who had relatives on all the islands, and Peaks, despite being more of a commuter island than some of the other islands, you know, we have people going back 5-6 generations here, you know, who've been here forever, and, you know, are planted here, just like Long and Cliff have, and Shabig have people multi-generational. But yeah, that was often one of the more, and then the lack of travel. You know, back in the mid 80s, I had people not only who hadn't been to Portland in a long time, but they hadn't been to the other side of the island in a long time. And so, you know, people kind of, so for instance, you know, living out here, we found out at one point Peaks Island had 5 grocery stores. We have 850 people year round right now. And the 5 little community people would go to their community grocery store, and there weren't any cars out back in the day, and they would stay on their little section of the island, and to travel to the north end to buy something in another grocery store was a big deal. So a couple of those things surprised me a lot.
the story of the book is in part, I feel like, the story of you going from, it was oblivious to island mores was the nice phrase on the jacket flare, but going from being oblivious to going to being, embraced as part of the community. And this is probably a question that is very difficult to answer concisely, but what did you learn, in a short period of time, that allowed you to get wise to some of the ways of the island that you felt oblivious to when you first showed up? What were the tricks that allowed you to sort of ingratiate yourself to your neighbors, feel like you were part of a community, and develop enough of a rapport with people that you could work with them in like the very intimate ways that a doctor has to work with people?
Yeah, it helped that we had children. We had our daughter Kate when we first moved out here, and then later Molly. And being in kind of a bigger group then of parents with young children, that was very accepting. My wife Sandy, after a few years on the island, commuting back and forth, being a social worker in Portland, she quit that job and became a plumber and electrician assistant on the island part-time, to be closer, if the kids had problems, if they were in daycare out here. And so, those things, between her connections to people, being in people's houses, being in the trades, really made a big difference in acceptance. I think I was accepted more because of Sandy's connection to the trades and maybe anything else. Our kids, would play, and at an early age, our children were able to, move around the island very freely, by bicycle, walking back and forth eventually to school. And so, and I also joined the Lions Club. I managed to join an organization, but I was so busy that after a couple of years, I sent in my dues again, and I got a letter back from the Lions Club saying, Chuck, if you're going to be in a Lions Club, you actually have to go to an occasional meeting. You can't just say you're a lion, So
we can't, in good conscience, cash this check unless you start showing up.
Right. Yeah. So yeah.
Is there a sense in which the islands of Casco Bay feel closer to the mainland now in 2021 than they did when you were first learning your way around in the mid 80s?
Oh, absolutely. For years and years, people tried to have a water taxi business out on the islands, and it would work pretty well seasonally, but then, there just weren't enough people who could afford a water taxi in the winter, and they would go belly up, or it was just too difficult to do. Now I think we have 5 water taxi services year round. And so, the amount of wealth, and people being able to afford to, have a water taxi in off hours, or to be able to get into town, for an early plane flight. And yet, a lot remains the same. It's kind of interesting. People can complain about, everything's changing, and but a lot of the new people who come out here kind of quirky in their own way. If they live year round, as I think they decide to do in some of the other islands, they they end up fitting in, or if they don't feel like they're fitting in, they eventually move off. So a lot of the people who've come in recent years, we've made new friends with some newcomers, and as much as things change, things are still great. We've always enjoyed living out here.
Fair to say, I mean, this is the reputation that the island communities in Maine and elsewhere have, but that there's a sense of neighborliness that's more entrenched, in the island communities than, or maybe hasn't been eroded by just the 21st century, in the same way that it has on the mainland. I mean, do you still feel that?
I do. So, for instance, one of the public health nurses managed to help us get a COVID vaccination clinic out here. We've had
of course.
3, and the amount of volunteers who helped us put on those clinics from the island was just amazing. And there was such a great sense of being a big extended neighborhood, having a clinic first for our above 70-year-olds, and then above 60-year-olds, and plus we got to see people who we hadn't seen in a long time with COVID.
Yeah.
As you know, there's a lot of people you know, if you haven't seen them on Zoom, you haven't seen them.
Yeah, sure. We're all rediscovering our neighbors a little bit. It feels like these
Yeah,
last little bit.
yeah. And I made a few house calls, you know, because again, there are people who couldn't really leave their house, you know, to get their vaccine. So that was fun seeing some of my old patients to give them the vaccination. So yeah, there is and you know, there's definitely a rough side to every island, you know, as there is to
Sure.
every place in town. So there are some dark sides of what goes on in any neighborhood. So.
Yeah, yeah, no, that makes sense. And I'm sure people listening are thinking about their own town, wherever they are, their own neighborhood, and nodding in recognition. I think that's something that's great about the book, is that even though living in an island community and in a place that did feel a little more isolated, 40 years ago than it does now, the web of relationships is recognizable to anyone who's lived in a small community or had to ingratiate themselves into a new neighborhood or move to Maine, frankly, from outside of it, and had to sort of puzzle through that sort of rubric of belonging and not belonging. I see people in the comments sort of chiming in. One thing I love about the book is how candidly you write about the challenges of the profession without getting too wonky or detailed or into territory that it would require somebody with a real familiarity with medicine to understand. And there are places where that pops up in small ways, talking about the real risk of workaholism that I imagine is probably not unique to someone working in an island community, but maybe is more unique to someone who is encountering all of their patients or many of their patients on a real daily basis. Can't avoid them to the same degree as you could if you had been working in a larger urban area, for example. And you write a little bit about how the way that the time you would spend small talking with people would just add up to where it became difficult to balance the job with your family life. And I wonder if you think a doctor in a rural or an isolated community is more prone to fall prey to that kind of thing in particular, the small talk and the casual conversations and the unplanned run-ins eating away at life, more so than a mechanic or a librarian or what your wife might have to say about that.
I think that trying to keep a balance between long hours at work and getting to know people and not just spending a few minutes, but really kind of delving into people's problems, particularly mental health problems, take a lot of time to sort out, particularly if they're impacting physical problems. I think I learned eventually that you can never reach a balance, but if you're trying to reach a balance, you're trying to not say yes to everything, and to balance that with as much family life as you can have, that you can get through those really difficult days and weeks. When sometimes I would get home late, and when the kids were little, it was hard to be able to get home before they went to bed a lot of times, and that created quite a lot of stress in our family. And ultimately, I would kind of reboot things, and I'd try to cut back on something, but things would always keep emerging. So the thing about rural physicians, if they settle in a small community, there is that pressure of getting to know people, but it's also part of the delight. I would say in many ways, in my experience over these years, physicians who really connect with their patients, even if they're in a really, really busy practice in a rural area, they tend to burn out less than an urban physician who's very busy, who's kind of not seeing the same person twice very often, and maybe under the gun now of electronic medical records, and maybe they're an employee and there's expectation. So, I think in many ways, rural physicians are more likely to be beloved by their community, and that helps the family of the physician, kind of manage things.
That's really interesting. Yeah. You and I talked a little on the phone a month or so ago about how you said, during the long process of writing and revising this book, and I'd like to ask you about that in a second, you sort of discovered the degree to which there is kind of this subgenre of the rural doctor or the isolated physician memoir, and how you dove into that a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like to discover that there is this body of literature out there that you were joining?
Right. I after I wrote this, the first go around 2000, I began to be aware of other physician writers. More of them tend to be surgeons in the big picture. And I think surgery is often very exciting and lends itself to writing. But there have been a few, who've done primary care. There's a physician out on Cape Cod right now who has had a primary care, not Cape Cod, Nantucket. And he's been there for decades. And he wasn't the writer of his book. A woman from New York Times wrote a book about him, about island medicine. And he's just a delightful character. And I think to really be able to stick with it year in and year out like he has, and to have some of the similar challenges that I had, you have to march to a different drummer. And I know what helped me, because I've always written something, ever since high school, written short essays or longer stories. What helped me in medicine is that I would have this downtime, and I was interested in kind of remembering quotes from patients. I would always carry, this is kind of a pocket calendar that I still carry. This is, there we go, 2021. It goes in my top pocket, very retro. And if I was in a visit with a patient, I would have that open often. And if they said something memorable that I hoped to someday put into an essay, I would just quietly write out the quote or get as much of the quote as I could. And those really add up. So for instance, I had an elderly lady, this isn't in the book, who, back in the day when she just had too many medical comorbidities to have a hip replacement. She was in her late 80s, and she was having a really hard time getting around. And so, it came up, can you give me something stronger for pain? And so I gave her like a quarter of oxycodone twice a day that she would take. And she came back and was really happy about that. And she was a good candidate. It wasn't affecting her balance. She wasn't going to have problems with addiction, but it really helped her get around better. She said, that medicine you gave me, that oxycondom, it protects me from pain. And I go, okay, let me write that down. So people would say the darndest stuff, and I would often, just quietly write something down. So,
budding journalists, take note. The tiny little notebooks should always be in your back pocket. Yeah, I think that's terrific advice. But that's interesting to me to hear you say that, and it's interesting for me to hear you mention the notion that a lot of that medical literature was coming from surgeons, because of course you make the point at one point in the book that I'm sure is not an original observation, but it's very poignant, that someone working in general practice, the degree of trauma or severity or potential tragedy from one patient to the next can oscillate wildly, and that you will wrap up a well child visit in the early afternoon, and your very next patient you might have to deliver really serious news to. And there are, without giving anything away, there are some genuine tragedies that take place in the book. As a writer, having to recount the experience of family medicine and general practice, how do you make the decisions about, look, if you only include the swashbuckling stuff, maybe it's a more exciting book, but it's not an accurate picture of the profession and of your relationships with people. Of course, if you include all of the really banal stuff, it is not going to be a very exciting book. I feel like you've struck the right balance. To what degree did you think about that as you were putting this together?
Yeah, I eventually did a better job with that. You know, I found my early efforts at writing this book didn't have enough balance. You know, so for instance, eventually where I came to was that, you know, if I had something that was very serious, I would almost within a page or two have something that was humorous or odd, or just kind of move completely away from the pathos of something that had just happened. And that actually would be closer to what happened in real life. And I found that even though I wouldn't be writing down 5 patients' names that I had seen in a morning, and I would just kind of go through that, I found the balance of that sometimes would give me a breather. You know, I didn't want to pile on to some really sad stuff that would happen without a break. So I tried to build things up, and I tried to, I don't know if it was always successful in balancing it with some humor.
Yeah, I imagine that reflects the reality of your experience, maybe sometimes in ways that could be unmooring, that the very difficult encounters often came on the heels or were followed by things that were just absurd.
Yeah, and I think some of that's just the training you go through. Eventually you can kind of block something out after you leave the room to be able to go on, you know, and keep an open mind about the next patient. Hi, Darcy.
Hello, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have so many audience questions. I want to make sure that we get to them
Terrific.
before our time is out. Thank you both so much thus far. And I'll start actually, since we just talked about pacing and writing in between, you know, the banal and the swashbuckling. Sam asked if you could talk a little bit about how your robust sense of humor relates to your practice of medicine, and I would say to your writing style as well.
I'm sorry, I missed the very beginning of that. He
Sure.
asked, could you repeat that one more time?
Absolutely. Could you talk a little bit about how your robust sense of humor relates to your practice of medicine? And then I added, and to your writing.
Yeah, I think it was a good safety valve. You know, and the nurses who've worked with me over the years have have had great, not only being great nurses, but great personalities, so that I would go out of my way, you know, to try to find something light to balance something that was tragic. Sometimes you just can't get around that, you know, really tragic things happen, and in every area of medicine. You know, I would see people at home from time to time, you know, who for a while we didn't have hospice come out here. And so, you know, I would see people, you know, who were dying of a brain tumor, and you know, it was just tragic, you know, particularly the other family members. And you know, I'd go home and I would try to have fun with my kids and lighten it up, because I think if you can't deal with that kind of stress with some lightness, you know, you're going to get dragged down. You're not going to have the longevity in a practice that I hope to be able to have.
Fantastic. This is also kind of relating to the way I guess you approach things. But Robert wants to know your experiences and simpatico for others is evident in your presentation. Your experiences as both a rural and urban physician are unique, which is definitely something you two have talked about. What sort of differences do you see in the expectations, stoicism, fear, and understanding of the importance of medical care between the two groups of rural and urban patients?
I love that question.
Let me parse that a little bit. You know, between the similarities and the difference between the two. You know, I have to say that I didn't make, I never really made note if somebody was even in town, if they came from a rural area versus city, because you know, so many city people grew up on a farm, or you know, there's this, in a way, a false dichotomy of, you know, urban people and rural people, and I would always try to find out something interesting about a person early on to write down in their medical record, and that's something that would help me remember something that about them that I thought would be important. And I never really, you know, the urban folks would have higher expectations. Obviously, you know, they're more specialty oriented, and people, you know, they would have higher expectations for care. But yeah, I wish I could say more about that, but I can't. Yeah.
No, that's great. Okay, this next one is, when did you know you were going to write this book?
Right. Yeah, around 1988. Yeah, I had a lot of, you know, pecking away at a Mac early on. I don't know what year that was, but the kids were really little. Early on, I had an idea that I would go back and forth between my last year of residency, all hospital-based, and then traveling to the other islands, and maybe the first few months of being in practice. But I didn't get good feedback on that. It was kind of plodding and hadn't learned how to lighten things up enough. So it went back to the late 80s. And, you know, the book almost was used in 2001. I had an agent. It was a different book than it is now. And that person really, it was right, 9/11 happened right then. And, you know, she couldn't find a buyer for it. And then I got really busy with family and practice, and I just put it on the shelf. And eventually I have to thank Bill Rohrbach, who had a service. You know, he would charge a certain amount to look at a manuscript, and he would critique it, I mean, really at length. And that's hard to listen to someone critique your work really in detail, including the warts and things that he didn't like. But I think he was very right. One, he was right about including more Sandy, my wife. You know, he thought that, you know, that she belonged, particularly since, you know, as a family, we had a lot of struggles to include her, and about pacing. And then ultimately, then the book, after lots of revisions, sat for a long time. I would write other essays about different things. And then I was lucky enough to have Jean Fredericks become my agent a couple of years ago. And she was really great in getting the book out there and selling it. And so, and apparently, I'm going to have a second book that's going to come out a year from now. So, yeah, so that's the history.
It's funny, someone just asked if your next book is going to be a compilations of your published short stories.
No, it is a continuation chronologically of when the first book ends. And eventually it will go right up to the point when I leave the island for a couple of years to get training in rheumatology and clinical immunology. And so some of the same people are in the second book. Yeah.
Great. I'm going to combine two questions here. Karen asked if there's time, we'd like to know a little bit about your background in boating before taking on this role. And then someone asked if you have any small boat stories.
Sure. You know, I grew up near a river in New Jersey, and I built a raft with my friend Tux when we were 9 or 10 years old, and we were intent on going downstream all the way into Newark and New York City Harbor until we came to the first of about 20 dams, you know, so we never did that. So, you know, I always liked being on the water. I fished a lot growing up in this little river. And ultimately, never had a boat till we came out here, and I bought a boat. Didn't, you know, it was an out, you know, it wasn't a cuddy cabin, it was an open boat, and I left it out too late into the fall. The very first year I had it about 12 weeks. And one by one, if you've been along the coast, like most of the people watching this, you see the boats on moorings, they disappear. A nice weekend in October, people are ramping them up the boat ramp, until in November, mine was the only boat out there when a big storm came up the coast. And I eventually watched it go down from the beach, because it was just about, 100 yards offshore. And a friend helped me drag it to the surface the next day, which is a beautiful day in November. And we towed it to Portland. And I'm just really excited. He said you can clean the engine. They'll flush out the engine. It should be okay. He's towing it behind his boat. It's out of the water. You make a little turn and it flips over about 50 yards from shore in South Portland into much deeper water. And that boat was totaled. So yeah, my first boat I sank. My other boats have been little, what are called sea dory boats, and I haven't sunk any of those. So they've made it through. And I go, I leave my boat in year round. I've been lucky enough to be able to take the boat and commute in it for a long time.
Okay. Neil asks, could you imagine not living on peaks?
I wonder if that's my wife's father, who's in his mid-90s. He's been angling for us to move to town for about 25 years. No, we've never seriously entertained moving off the island. It's been a great place to live, still is.
Okay. Sam wants to know if you could talk a little bit about how you got involved in your work with Africa. And I think they might know you. They say in relating to the tragic death of a young Portland immigrant.
Sure. Both my children went through the public school here on Peaks Island through 5th grade, and they took the ferry to Portland, where they went to middle school and eventually Portland High School. And even back then, Portland High School was a high percentage of asylum seekers, immigrants, first from like Asia, then Middle East, and more recently Africa. Unfortunately, one of the young men who graduated from Portland High School, a little older than my daughter, he worked as a security guard at Mercy Hospital, and he went out in the parking lot and he was shot and killed in the middle of the night. This is now 12 years ago. And since we really felt this connection to Portland High School, I worked with other interested people and the family to develop scholarships for asylum seekers, for graduating, it's pretty specific, graduating African immigrants from Portland High School to go to Southern Maine Community College. And we were able to cobble that together. We still do it. We award 1 or 2 scholarships a year. And we've had seniors from probably 7 different African countries get the scholarship. And it's been really great seeing them move there. And from that, I ended up going to Africa because of those connections and doing some work in South Sudan and Uganda.
Okay, back to some writing questions. Lloyd wants to know what writers inspired you to become one. And I would add any favorite memoirs and who do you read for fun? So it's a tri-part question. But.
Wow. So, I have tried to emulate James Herriot a bit, even though he was a vet. I really loved his descriptions of where he lived and the people he worked with, as well as the animal work he did. I think his characters would keep appearing in his books, so he had, you kind of got to know the characters. So I liked his writing a lot. For 20 some odd years, I've read everything that John McPhee has written. I think in terms of being able to paint a scene or talk to people in various scenes, he's a master at being able to be concise and not overly wordy. And then Atul Gawande, a physician writer. I think he's very eloquent, and he writes about a lot of important issues in medicine. And so those would be the three that that I admire most. It's interesting because I'm very eclectic in terms of what I enjoy reading for fun. I don't read mysteries, but pretty much everything else. I'm kind of voracious for I'm looking at around the world in 80 trees, wild trees. I guess more botany than anything for fun. So.
All right. And then Neil asked, have you ever had any formal training to develop your writing craft? I know you mentioned working with Bill on the editorial side, but maybe before then.
No, I was a science geek. I was headed into marine biology for a long time rather than medicine. And I never took a writing class. I practiced, I heard and believe it myself that, if you want to write well, you have to read good writing and read a lot of it. And I really love to read. And so that part of it, but I've never carved out time, to go to a writing conference or take a class. I don't know how unusual that is. I mean, who knows?
Josie wants to know, did you ever interact with the medical ship Sunbeam?
No, I'm aware of the work they do up the coast, and they, I won't say they never came down to Casco Bay because I'm not sure about that, but in general, their work is, Islesboro and the other year-round islands farther to the north. And for people, who are from outside of Maine, we have 14 year-round islands. I define a year-round island as having a school. So it's really year-round. And, in the whole eastern seaboard, there's not, we have by far the most year-round islands. And there's only a handful up and down the rest of the coast. So it's an interesting way that Sunbeam, kind of helps those other islands that have sometimes almost, much less medical care than the Casco Bay Islands do now.
Speaking of that, Robert wanted to know, he says, there's a group of Canadians who take the absolute most of your efforts. Have you ever considered providing medical services to other countries in North America?
Not really. I have a son-in-law who's Canadian, who is in family practice training. I'd tag along with him if he went home, if he had something for me to do up in Canada. Canadians, even as polite as they are, they still get sick. So.
Okay, we have time for one more. So this one comes from Cindy. You talked about humor helping to offset the stress of being a physician. Does your writing do the same? Is it a form of release?
Yeah. When it's going well, I find that it's very satisfying. And probably, like everybody who writes, it doesn't always go well. I kind of have a better feeling now than I used to that when it's done, and that's very satisfying. Yeah, I mean, I don't find it stressful to write, so I would say, actually, I do find it relaxing to write. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you both so much for this conversation. Fantastic way to spend a Thursday. And as I said, we'll be coordinating some signed copies, so you can click right on over to print to check those out. And thank you everyone for coming out tonight as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chuck, for a terrific book.
Yes.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks everyone. Have a good night.
Bye-bye now.